Hello and welcome to Newsmax TV. I'm John Bachman. Joining me right now on the phone is Alan Dershowitz. He's a Harvard professor, an expert criminal defense attorney, and one of the foremost authorities on the nation of Israel. And today we're taking a look back at the life of Ariel Sharon, a former prime minister and ex-general of the Israeli army, obviously a huge figure in the history of the nation of Israel. Thanks for being with us, Professor Dershowitz.
Well, thank you. General Sharon, Prime Minister Sharon's passing is a sad day not only for Israel but for the world. I had the privilege of knowing Prime Minister Sharon quite well. I was actually with him in his office just weeks before he suffered his stroke, and we had a private meeting at which he told me that he was planning to go further in his decision regarding Gaza, which ended the occupation of Gaza, and he was anticipating also some unilateral steps in parts of the West Bank as well. So he was a man who was a great warrior, but also a great man of peace.
And what brought about that change? And we're talking about the 1995 unilateral withdrawal of Gaza, and for a lot of people who aren't as familiar with Ariel Sharon in his past might not realize that he was, had this nickname, he was the bulldozer, he was known as maybe the father of the settlement movement in Israel. But for him to make that decision, to make that unilateral withdrawal back in 1995, how pivotal was that? And is that really the defining moment of his legacy for Israel?
Well, not only was it a defining moment for Israel, it was probably one of the most controversial decisions any prime minister made. I have a personal story about that. I was getting an honorary doctorate from a university in Israel, and it was being presented to me by Prime Minister Sharon. And my relatives, some of my relatives who are extreme right-wingers in Israel, refused to come to see me get my degree because Prime Minister Sharon was presenting it to me. They then came to the reception afterward because Prime Minister Sharon had left, but they didn't want to in any way honor him by coming to an event that he spoke at. That's how controversial it was. Look, a lot of Israelis, even today, think it was a mistake not to leave the Gaza, but to leave it unilaterally, not in exchange for anything from the Palestinians. And of course, Gaza has become a source of rocket fire. So it's still a controversial move, but he was a George Washington figure in some ways. That is, a great warrior when Israel needed a warrior. He helped turn around the 1973 war, which could have been an absolute disaster to Israel, a surprise attack on Yom Kippur, both by the Syrian and Egyptians, and he turned it around by crossing the canal and going into Egypt. And then when he became the prime minister, he moved much more toward peace, doing the unilateral move in Gaza and forming a new party, a more centrist party, the Kadima party, which ultimately resulted in Ehud Olmert being elected and Olmert offering the Palestinians an even better deal than the Labor Party had offered back in 2001. Of course, the Palestinians didn't accept either of those deals, and that's why there is still an occupation and still no peace in the Middle East.
This is a guy who was known as the butcher of Beirut by people in Lebanon, but he did make this huge shift in ideology and initiative. Was there one thing specifically that he ever told you about that kind of brought about that change, or was it just a cumulative effect that all that he has seen as being a general, as being the Minister of Defense for Israel? Was there anything specific that he mentioned that caused him to shift?
Several things. Number one, his change of position. He was no longer assigned to be a warrior. He was assigned to be the prime minister of all the people. Second, I think the false charge that was made against him in Lebanon had a big impact on him. In fact, the last meeting I had with him, he said, withhold judgment on Sabra and Shatila because within a few years they will be releasing some of the confidential material, and you'll see that my role is very different from the one attributed to me by some of the reports. People forget that he didn't lift a weapon, he didn't shoot a single person, he didn't order the shooting of anybody. What happened at Shatila and Sabra were that Lebanese Christians who had been massacred by Muslims previously and whose leader had been assassinated, the Lebanese Christians took revenge, and they were the ones who killed the people in Sabra and Shatila, and yet Sharon was blamed for it. And I think that had a big impact on his psychological approach. And perhaps he wanted to vindicate his legacy, but I think he also thought he was doing the right thing, that the occupation of Gaza was serving no important security interest, and his focus was always almost exclusively on security.
Now, earlier you mentioned that he was a George Washington figure. In terms of the leaders of this generation, where does he stack up in terms of importance?
Well, very, very high, because his military victories were equivalent to what George Washington did at Valley Forge and the evacuation of Brooklyn, and some of the most brilliant military decisions that a general ever made. And the United States would not have come into being but for George Washington's military leadership, and then, of course, he became a great president and a man of peace. And I think Israel might not have survived 1973 but for the great military innovation and leadership that then General Sharon practiced. But his history goes back to the founding of Israel as a military, creative, innovative, courageous person. And, the psalmist said once, the Lord will give the Jewish people strength, and only then will the Jewish people get peace. He understood that for the Jewish people and for the Jewish state of Israel, strength was a prerequisite for peace. And he wanted to see both strength and peace. So he really ranks very high in the pantheon of great Jewish leaders. And I think the Israeli people and the world should recognize that.
And I think that certainly will come here, and we want to wish, his family, we give them our best, and there's certainly been our thoughts. And Professor Dershowitz, thank you for sharing your personal insight in stories of Ariel Sharon, who had been in a coma, passing away now, and a pivotal leader, a monumental figure in history. Thanks so much for being with us, Professor.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for watching Newsmax TV.